What if your sister's death wasn't the end, but an invitation? When Grace returns to her rural hometown after her sister Clara's mysterious suicide, she uncovers a series of cryptic messages, ritualistic symbols, and whispers buried beneath the soil. As grief spirals into obsession and the past claws back through bloodlines and broken oaths, Grace must decide whether to run or to finish what her sister started. Because in this town, the dead don't rest. They remember, and they've been waiting for her. Welcome to a story where legacy is a curse, and digging for the truth might just bury you alive. No one heard Clara scream when the earth swallowed her whole, except the thing that lives beneath it. The rain had been falling for 2 days straight in Pine Hollow, and the cemetery looked more like a battlefield than a resting place. Brown water sluiced between tilted headstones, carving channels through the earth like it was trying to unearth something buried deep. Sheriff Mason Rourke stepped out of his cruiser, boots sinking immediately into the wet gravel. The sky overhead hung low and heavy, a dull gray canvas ready to collapse. Clara Winslow's grave was open. Not disturbed, not vandalized. Open, like the earth had yawned and decided to take her back. He didn't want to be here, but the calls wouldn't stop coming. First from the groundskeeper, then from the Historical Society. Then, most unsettlingly, from the Reverend, who had a tremor in his voice when he whispered, "It's back." Rourke didn't ask what it was, not yet. He stepped closer to the hole. Mud sloshed around the collapsed coffin, which had cracked open at the side. No body inside. No sign of digging, no prints. The rain had wiped everything clean, too clean. It was like Clara had clawed her way out and then vanished. But that was impossible. She'd been dead for 6 years. Shot twice in the back and buried with a rosary clenched in her hand. Rourke rubbed the back of his neck and turned to the small crowd gathered behind the wrought iron fence. Locals, mostly older folks. Pale faces. Nobody spoke. Not even the preacher, who stood with his hat in hand and eyes on the dirt like he was praying it wouldn't move again. "Anyone touch the grave?" Rourke called out. Silence. Then old May Kendrick, her wrinkled hands clutching an umbrella too flimsy for the wind, murmured, "You should have left her bones alone." Rourke frowned. "No one touched it. There's no sign anyone did." She shook her head, gray curls trembling. "Not now. I mean years ago, when they built the new church wing. They moved the corner markers, said the soil didn't matter, said spirits don't cling to dirt." She let the words hang in the mist. The sheriff looked back down into the pit. Water shimmered over dark roots, curled like fingers around the coffin's broken edges. Something about the shape of them, the way they reached inward, not outward, made his stomach knot. Later, back at the station, Rourke laid out the old case files. Clara Winslow had been an elementary school teacher, beloved by her students, quiet with neighbors, mostly kept to herself. The night she died, she'd left a message on the emergency line, just static, then a low whisper that hadn't been deciphered. The investigation had led nowhere. No prints, no suspect, no motive, just blood on the kitchen tiles and 2.38 slugs in her spine. But something always bothered him. The message, that voice in the background, low, rasping, wet, like someone speaking underwater. He listened to it again now, headphones tight over his ears. The whisper came at the 39-second mark, the same as before, but this time, his gut twisted. He could understand it. "She fed us once. She'll feed again." Rourke ripped the headphones off and stared at the recorder like it'd grown teeth. He checked the timestamp. The audio file hadn't changed in 6 years. Same frequency, same distortion. So why could he understand it now? He didn't go home that night. Instead, he drove out to the Winslow place, which had been empty ever since Clara's death. The Historical Society owned it now, kept the power off and the doors chained. But Rourke had a key. He told himself it was protocol. He told himself it wasn't fear that made him double-check the ammo in his holster. The house smelled like wet plaster and mold. Floorboards moaned beneath his boots. Pictures still hung on the walls. Family portraits, a few of Clara's school kids holding up crayon drawings. Nothing had changed. But the basement door was open. Rourke had sealed it himself when the house was condemned. It shouldn't have been open. He drew his flashlight, clicked it on, and descended slowly. Dust floated like snow in the beam of light. The air grew colder with each step. By the time his boots touched the concrete floor, his breath was fogging in front of him. The room was empty except for one thing: a patch of soil. Not concrete, not old foundation, just soil, black and soft, surrounded by a ring of stones carved with strange marks. He knelt beside it. The soil was damp, fresh, somehow. He reached out and sifted a handful through his fingers. It stuck to his skin, thick and cloying, almost warm. And then he heard it, a whisper, just beneath the surface. Not from the room, from the earth itself. He held his breath. "Sheriff!" He stood up, too fast, heart hammering, hand on his gun. The voice had said his name, not just a whisper. His name. He wasn't imagining it. The soil shifted, just barely, like something turning over in its sleep. Rourke backed up, eyes locked on the patch. He reached for the walkie clipped to his belt, but it only hissed static. Then the whisper came again. "We remember." And something tapped from beneath the ground. 3 slow knocks, like a call and response from a place older than language. He ran. He didn't remember the drive back, only that it was still raining, and every puddle on the road seemed deeper than it should have been, bottomless, almost. At dawn, he called Grace Caldwell, Clara's sister, now living in Baton Rouge. When she heard what had happened, she didn't sound surprised, only scared. "I told you not to bury her in that town," she said. "She didn't die normal, Sheriff. She was taken. They used her. That soil's cursed. You disturbed it. She died of gunshot wounds, Ms. Caldwell. She died screaming your name, didn't she?" Rourke's mouth went dry. There was a long pause on the line. Then Grace whispered something that made the blood freeze in his veins. "She told me in a dream last week. She said, 'They're hungry again.' And she wasn't talking about people." Rourke couldn't sleep. He sat alone in the station long after the phones had stopped ringing, long after the rain had become a dull background hiss against the windows. His mind replayed the call with Grace Caldwell in a loop, her voice like brittle glass cracking under weight unseen. "They're hungry again." The words felt like a rusted hook in his gut. He tried to ground himself in facts. Clara Winslow had been murdered. The case went cold. Her grave was undisturbed for 6 years. Then the coffin split open from inside. No signs of force, no intruder, no vandal, nothing human, but none of it explained the whisper he'd heard in the basement, or the soil. Still damp, still warm, as if it bled breath, still full of memory. And there was something else. The ring of carved stones around that patch of earth. Rourke had seen something like it before. He dug into the old case logs again, this time going further back. Dusty boxes labeled mundane, historical crimes, superstition reports. The kind of junk cops tossed aside when they didn't want paperwork haunting them. Then he found it, a report from 1962, typed on a fading typewriter, filed under unresolved. A woman named Edna Palmer had gone missing just outside Pine Hollow, not far from where Clara's home stood now. Her body was never found. But the strange part? Her husband claimed she was swallowed by the earth. At first, Rourke rolled his eyes. Grief made people say wild things. But then came the photo, stapled to the back of the file. It showed a circle of stones, just like the one in Clara's basement, carved symbols, uneven pattern. One of the deputies had scrawled, "Possible ritual site in the margins." He read further. The final line of the report struck a nerve. Soil at the site warm to the touch. Faint vibration noted beneath. No logical source. Rourke leaned back, hands trembling. The same thing, decades apart. Same soil, same silence. Pine Hollow was hiding something. By morning, the rain had finally broken. leaving behind a thick mist that clung to the town like breath on glass. Rourke drove out to see someone he hadn't spoken to in years, Reverend Harrow. The chapel sat on the edge of town, newer than most of Pine Hollow's bones, built after a fire had burned the original one to cinders. Locals whispered that the fire had started in the old ossuary beneath the chapel floor. No official cause was ever confirmed. Reverend Harrow was waiting in the pews, alone, hands folded. "You saw it, didn't you?" he asked, not even waiting for a greeting. Rourke sat down beside him, suddenly aware of the weight in his chest. "I saw a grave collapse. A coffin cracked. No body." "I saw things. That don't make sense." "You heard it whisper?" Rourke didn't answer. The Reverend nodded slowly. "It speaks to those who walk close enough to the wound." "What wound?" Rourke asked. "The land, Sheriff. The old places. This town was built on them. You ever wonder why the oldest buildings in Pine Hollow have basements made of soil, not stone? It's not by accident. The founding families believed it was sacred, so the ground needed to breathe." Rourke exhaled sharply. "You mean they were feeding something?" The Reverend didn't blink, not always willingly. For a long time, they sat in silence. Then Harrow whispered, "It's not just Clara. There'll be others." The soil remembers every offering. Later that day, Rourke returned to the Winslow home. Not alone this time. He brought with him a camera, soil sample kits, and a crowbar. He needed answers, needed to see what was underneath that patch of earth. The basement was darker than before, the air somehow heavier. The ring of stones was undisturbed. The center of the patch was still warm. He crouched, dug the crowbar into the soft earth and pried a chunk loose. The soil was rich and dark, but interspersed in it were tiny, pale fragments, bones, not animal, human. He scraped again, unearthed the edge of something metallic. Reaching in, he pulled free an old locket, caked in filth. Inside was a photo, faded but recognizable, a woman in 1950s attire. Edna Palmer. He staggered back. Then the whisper came again, clearer, closer. The mind becomes two. The basement lights flickered. The door slammed shut upstairs, and behind him, the soil moved. He turned in time to see something rise from it, a shape, female, hair slick with black mud, eyes wide and white like bone. Clara, or what was left of her. But she didn't crawl. She floated, her feet an inch above the ground, soil falling from her like tears. Her mouth opened, and from it came not breath, but the same voice from the recording. "She fed us once." Rourke reached for his gun, fired once, twice. The bullets passed through her like smoke. She whispered again, "So will you." The earth opened beneath him, and Pine Hollow forgot him. Only the whisper remained. The air in Pine Hollow felt heavier the morning after Sheriff Rourke disappeared. Grace Caldwell sat in her cluttered kitchen, staring into a cup of black coffee that had long gone cold. The wind outside howled against the thin windows like a dog scratching to be let in. Something had shifted, subtle but undeniable. It wasn't just the weather or the pressure of storm fronts. It was inside the town, in the soil, in the silence. She'd called the station 3 times since dawn, each ring swallowed by the same static-laced voicemail. The deputy, a skittish kid named Byron, finally answered around 9 a.m., voice taut and distracted. "Sheriff's out," he'd mumbled. "Out where?" "Didn't say, just left." Grace didn't believe it, not for a second. Not after the phone call she'd made to him the night before, not after what she'd said. "They're hungry again." She hadn't used those words in over 30 years. Now they clung to her like damp cotton. She stood from the table, back aching from age and worry, and crossed the room to her pantry. It was hidden behind an old wooden door, the kind with warped hinges and a keyhole nobody used anymore. From the top shelf, she pulled down a tin box, dented and rusting at the corners. Inside were memories most people would have burned. A photograph, yellowed with time. 7 girls, standing in a half circle, hands linked. In the middle stood Clara Winslow, barely 17, grinning too wide. A leather-bound notebook, stained by soil, and a key. The notebook was brittle when she opened it, pages thin as moth wings. She turned past sketches of symbols, half-remembered rituals, and strange instructions scrawled in block letters. Salt the threshold. Speak only at dusk. Bury the bones westward. She stopped at a page marked with a charcoal drawing, a ring of stones, identical to the one she remembered from that long-ago summer. Underneath it a single phrase, "The hollow drinks what the heart denies." Grace closed the book slowly. She couldn't pretend anymore. Not after seeing Clara's face on the news. Not after hearing her own voice whisper back from the void. It was happening again, and she was the only one left who remembered what they'd done. She left the house, wrapped in her old wool coat, walking stick in hand, and made her way to the library, one of the few buildings in Pine Hollow that hadn't been gutted by time or budget cuts. The librarian, Martha Green, greeted her with a raised eyebrow. "You're up early," Martha said. "Looking for another gardening book?" Grace managed a tight smile. "Something like that." The back archives were kept in a locked room behind the local history section, a space few people entered and fewer still cared about. But Grace had spent long nights there as a teenager, researching rituals she didn't fully understand, trying to make sense of the things they'd been told, the things they'd seen. She moved past stacks of brittle newspapers and tax records until she found the section she needed: folklore, myth, and settlement history of Warren County. Her fingers landed on an old volume, Echoes in the Earth, Early Accounts from Pine Hollow and Surrounding Towns. Inside were stories collected from settlers, handwritten letters, sermons from traveling ministers. Most of them read like paranoid ramblings, but one account caught her attention. In the fall of 1813, a woman named Tabitha Morey was exiled from the village for refusing the offering. She claimed the stones in her field wept at night, and her crops grew over shallow graves. Grace's throat went dry. The offering. That was what they'd called it. Not a sacrifice, not a ritual, just an offering. As if what lived beneath Pine Hollow was a neighbor to be appeased. She scanned the rest of the entry. It ended abruptly. No mention of what happened to Tabitha, just a scribbled note in the margin. Reckoning comes with the thaw. Grace snapped the book shut and looked around the archive room, half expecting shadows to shift in the corner. For a moment, she thought she heard something far below the foundation, like a deep hum buried in stone. She left the library in a daze and drove out to the edge of town, toward a place she hadn't visited since she was 17. The others had called it the Hollow, a thicket of pine trees just off the old rail line, now overgrown and long since forgotten by maps. But the stones were still there. She parked by the tree line and stepped into the woods, the cold wind biting through her coat. Branches clawed at her sleeves. The path had narrowed to nothing, but her feet remembered the way. And then, through the trees, she saw them, the ring. 7 stones, each one etched with a different symbol, faint, worn by time, but unmistakable. In the center, the ground had caved inward, forming a shallow bowl of earth. It was breathing. She knelt beside it, trembling. Something beneath the soil pulsed. Faint, like a heartbeat underwater, a warmth that didn't belong to the sun. Grace spoke aloud, voice shaking. "I was a child. We were all children." No answer. She stared down into the hollow, and for a moment she saw faces. Just shadows in the dirt, but familiar. Clara, Beth, Donna, and herself. "We thought we were protecting the town," she whispered. "We thought we were choosing, but it's always chosen us, hasn't it?" A low whisper threaded through the pines. Umity said, "6 remain." Grace turned, heart pounding, but the woods were empty. She stumbled back to her car, barely able to breathe. And when she reached the driver's seat, there was a single pine cone resting on the dashboard, damp with soil. Inside it was something sharp, something bone white. She drove off without looking back, but the whisper followed. That night, the sound came again. Light, deliberate steps above her ceiling. Grace lay frozen in bed, the blankets drawn up to her chest like a useless shield. The wind outside had died down hours ago, yet the rafters groaned with pressure, as if bearing the weight of something not meant to be here. Then came the voice, faint at first, like a memory pushed through a crack in time. "Gracie. Gracie, let me in." Grace hadn't been called Gracie in decades. She sat up slowly, heart hammering. Her house was silent. Too silent. Even the old grandfather clock in the hall had stopped ticking. Its hands locked at 3:13 a.m. She rose, took the flashlight from her bedside table, and walked barefoot down the creaking hall. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the house itself was resisting her movement, trying to keep her from reaching the attic door. The voice came again, clearer this time. "I'm cold, Gracie. You promised we'd stay warm." "Clara." The attic door groaned open with a soft pop, and a wave of freezing air rushed down. It smelled of pine and damp earth. Grace raised the flashlight and began climbing the narrow ladder. The beam cut through the dark like a blade, dust motes swirling in its path. Nothing. Just boxes, old trunks, and the ancient rocking chair that had belonged to her mother. But then the chair moved. Once. Back and forth. She didn't breathe. The light flickered, and for half a second she saw her. Clara Winslow, 17, her dress torn at the collar, skin the color of wet ash, eyes wide, black as pits, dirt caked into the hollow of her cheeks, her lips cracked and moving silently. Her smile was wrong, too slow, too wide, like the skin had forgotten how to stretch properly. Grace dropped the flashlight. The attic went black. By the time she scrambled down the ladder and slammed the attic shut, her hands were trembling so hard she couldn't lock the latch. She backed into the hallway, gasping. But the house remained still. No more footsteps, no more voice, only silence and the faint echoing creak of a rocking chair above. The next day, Grace drove to the church. St. Matthias Chapel sat at the far end of town, past the old mill road. No one really used it anymore, not since Pastor Milton died 5 years ago, and no one bothered to replace him. But the chapel had been there long before Pine Hollow was even called Pine Hollow, and Grace remembered what lay beneath it. She pushed open the rotting doors and stepped inside. The stained glass windows were dusted in grime, casting muted colors across the cracked pews. The air smelled of wax and mildew. It was darker than it should have been, as if the sun refused to reach through the glass. She walked down the aisle and knelt at the altar, not to pray but to search. Behind the pulpit, beneath a loose stone tile, lay a trap door. She pried it open with a rusted crowbar she'd brought in her coat. Beneath it, stone steps led down into a basement no one spoke of anymore. She descended. The chapel's undercroft was a single room, circular, carved directly into bedrock. 7 recesses lined the walls, each with remnants of something long buried: bones, old jars, ribbons, a child's shoe, and at the center, a slab of stone. The offering table. She'd helped carry Clara's body down here once. Grace stepped to the slab, placing her hand on the cold stone. Her skin crawled. Etched along the edge was a message, revealed now by decades of wear. The circle breaks when memory dies. Suddenly, a breath of air brushed her neck. She turned. Nobody. But when she looked back, the slab was no longer empty. Something had been placed on it. A handkerchief. Red gingham. Clara's. Soaked in fresh blood. Grace screamed and stumbled back, her foot catching on uneven stone, and from the shadows a voice hissed, "You left me undone." She fled up the stairs, out into the daylight, but the sun felt wrong, too distant, like it was filtering through layers of glass and smoke. Everything in Pine Hollow had begun to rot. Later that evening, the town square filled with whispers. Children cried without knowing why. Dogs barked at shadows in corners. The sky took on a purple hue, unnatural and bruised. At the diner, Deputy Byron sat in the back booth, staring at the same cup of coffee for over an hour. When the waitress asked if he was okay, he looked up slowly and said, "The sheriff came back last night." She blinked. "Came back? What do you mean?" Byron's voice dropped to a whisper. "He knocked on my window at 3:13 and I opened it, but it wasn't him. Not anymore." The waitress backed away slowly. That same night, 6 different households reported their clocks stopping at the same minute, 3:13 AM, and all of them heard scratch, not from the attic, from beneath the floorboards. At her kitchen table, Grace wrote furiously in the notebook she'd hidden for decades. She made lists, names, places. The 6 remaining girls from the circle. 2 were already dead. 3 had moved away. 1, her, had stayed behind. And the hollow was waking. Suddenly she froze. Her pen rolled off the table. The lights flickered once, twice. The walls creaked as if exhaling, and then she heard it again. A knock, not at the door, from inside the kitchen cabinet beneath the sink. 3 knocks, slow, deliberate. Knock, knock, knock. She didn't move. And then, from the darkness beneath the sink, a voice she hadn't heard since childhood. "It's your turn, Gracie. We're all waiting." Some things were never buried deep enough, especially when they were planted with the intent to grow back. The next morning, Grace drove out past the edge of town, where the asphalt surrendered to gravel and the gravel thinned into dirt. The trees grew thicker here, ancient oaks and pines with twisted limbs like arthritic fingers scratching at the sky. This was the road that no one used anymore, not since the fire, but Grace remembered it well. Back then it had been called Ash Creek Trail. Now the sign was rotted, the paint stripped by decades of rain and wind. No one had come here in years. She stepped out of her car, the cold hitting harder in this part of the woods. The air smelled wrong. Wet bark, rotting leaves, and something metallic. She walked the rest of the way by foot, boots sinking slightly into the moss-covered trees. The deeper she went, the quieter it became. Birds stopped singing. Even the wind seemed to hesitate here. Eventually she came upon the clearing. It was still there, half swallowed by nature but unmistakable. 7 stones formed a wide ring, their surfaces etched with weathered sigils. At the center stood a gnarled tree stump, blackened by fire but refusing to die. Green shoots curled from its edges like veins from a cauterized wound. This was where they had made the pact. 7 girls, all too young to understand what they'd done, all too frightened to back out. Clara had led the circle that night, barefoot and shaking. Grace could still see her holding that little leather-bound book with the cracked spine and whispering Latin phrases none of them understood. They had thought it was a game. Until the wind stopped. Until the blood dripped from Clara's nose onto the circle, and the fire at the stump turned blue. Grace knelt by one of the stones and brushed off the moss. Beneath it, a name. Anna Keller. Dead. Drowned in her bathtub 4 years ago. No sign of struggle, no water in her lungs, just her face, twisted in terror. Grace moved to the next stone. Naomi Griggs, dead, stroke, at 29. The third, Tanya Bell, still alive, moved to Oregon, changed her name, left no forwarding address. Only 4 of them remained, and something was collecting. She placed her hand on the stump. It pulsed, ever so faintly. Warm, alive. Suddenly from behind her, the soft crunch of leaves. She spun around. A man stood at the edge of the clearing, half shrouded in shadow. Tall, lean, with a broad-brimmed hat pulled low over his face. His coat was torn at the hem, streaked with something that looked suspiciously like dried mud or blood. "You shouldn't be here, Grace," he said. Her breath caught. "Mr. Danner?" The groundskeeper from the old chapel. He'd vanished a decade ago after the chapel was decommissioned. They said he left town. Others said he went mad. But Grace remembered. He was the one who locked the undercroft after Clara died, the one who whispered to Pastor Milton when no one was listening. "You remember?" Danner said, as if reading her thoughts. She stepped back instinctively. "You're not real. You're dead," he smiled. "Small, broken. So's half the town. Doesn't stop us walking." Grace swallowed. "Why now? Why is it waking?" Danner tilted his head. "You broke the circle. Clara wasn't meant to be left alone. When you abandoned her body, the pact held, but only barely. Time weakens what fear once kept sealed." He stepped forward, slow and deliberate. "Something came through that night. You gave it a name. It liked the name." "What name?" Grace asked, her voice trembling. His eyes darkened. "You called it Mother Hollow." A memory exploded behind her eyes. Clara in the circle, eyes rolled back, chanting through chattering teeth. "Meta Cavam, Meta Cavam," over and over, until her voice bled into a whisper not her own. "Where is she?" Grace asked, suddenly cold. "She's beneath," Danner said. "Always has been. She was never gone. She was just waiting for the right name, and now, the right vessel." Before Grace could respond, a sound rose from the stump behind her, a low, wet gurgle, like something breathing through earth. She turned just in time to see the soil within the ring begin to churn. Roots twitched. A thin hand, gray as slate, pushed up through the dirt. Then another. Grace screamed, but Danner was already gone. Back at her home that evening, Grace dug through the attic, tearing open boxes, flipping through old files until she found what she was looking for. The book. Clara's book. The binding was cracked, but the pages were intact. Dozens of handwritten passages, mixed with Latin and English. Rituals, drawings, crude diagrams of the circle and the stump. A map of the Undercroft, and on the last page, something she hadn't remembered. A family tree. The names weren't familiar at first, but then she saw the bottom row, her name, Grace Winslow, and beneath it, written in Clara's messy cursive, "Daughter of the blood, chosen vessel. Return her to the hollow, or the hollow will return to us." Grace's fingers trembled. The connection wasn't just spiritual, it was blood. They were related, half-sisters. Clara hadn't told anyone. But she'd known, and in death she had called Grace back. The realization struck her like ice in the lungs. She hadn't just been a witness to the ritual. She had been the offering all along, and now the hollow wanted what it was promised. Grace didn't sleep that night. She sat in the living room with every light on, the leather-bound book clenched in her hands like a crucifix. Wind scratched at the window panes in nervous bursts. The house groaned more than usual. Floorboards creaked upstairs, though no one lived above her. She thought about calling someone. Tanya? But she had changed her number long ago. Emily? She lived too far. Besides, what could she even say? "Hey, remember that ritual we did when we were kids? The one where Clara died? Turns out it was real, and now something's crawling out of the woods for me." No one would believe her. But something in the book, something she hadn't seen before, gave her direction. Buried in a page near the center, scrawled over a diagram of the chapel's foundations, was a single line. "Return to the crypt, open the stone, descend." The Undercroft, that part of the church had been sealed since the fire. The townspeople said it collapsed. Unstable, unsafe, but Grace remembered the smell. Damp earth and iron. And she remembered what Clara said before the ritual. If it works, that's where she'll come through. The hollow didn't rise from the sky. It came from below. At 2:41 a.m., Grace grabbed her coat and flashlight, stuffed Clara's book into a backpack, and drove toward the old chapel. The road there was worse than she remembered. Cracked, overgrown. At one point, a tree had fallen over the path, and she had to park and walk the rest of the way. The forest was alive with whispers. Not wind. Whispers. Too many to be birds. Too low to be insects. The chapel looked worse than before. Its steeple had collapsed entirely, and ivy clung to the crumbling stone like veins. The stained glass windows were shattered. Rainwater pooled inside where pews once stood. Moonlight spilled through the rafters like silver mist. She moved quickly, stepping over rubble and broken hymnals until she reached the rear wall, where the trapdoor to the undercroft had once been. It was still there, beneath a fallen pulpit, covered in soot and dust. Grace pulled at it. Wood groaned in protest. Then it gave. A rush of stale, damp air hit her in the face. It smelled of rot and something older, something feral. She clicked on her flashlight. The stone steps were slick, narrow. She descended slowly, one hand on the damp wall, the other gripping the light. The deeper she went, the colder it became. Her breath turned visible. Her ears popped. The hallway at the base opened into a wide chamber, round with a domed ceiling, like an inverted bowl. At its center was a stone altar covered in soot, bones, and melted wax. The walls were carved with sigils, some she recognized from the book, others older, deeper, like they'd been etched by claw instead of tool. Then she saw it. At the far end, beneath a rusted chain and iron plaque, was the stone. A wide, circular slab set into the floor, ringed with bone dust and sealed with what looked like ancient pitch. The inscription on the plaque had mostly eroded away. Only 3 words remained. "She waits below." Grace knelt, placing Clara's book on the slab. The pages fluttered open as if moved by unseen breath, stopping on a familiar diagram. The circle, the names, the offering. There were instructions. The book said the seal could be broken by blood. Grace hesitated. Then she pulled a rusted nail from the nearby altar, pressed it into her palm, and let the blood drip onto the edge of the slab. The pitch hissed. Cracks formed in the stone like lightning bolts. The iron chain snapped in half. A deep rumble shook the chamber. Dust fell from the ceiling. And then the slab moved. It slid aside with an impossible groan, revealing not a staircase, not a tunnel, but a hole, perfectly round, perfectly black. The light from her flashlight didn't touch the bottom. A scent rose from it, soil, ash, and milk, sour milk. She stared into the abyss, and the abyss breathed back. Then something moved in the dark. Grace stumbled backward. A hand, thin too long, fingers jointed like an insect's, reached out and gripped the edge of the pit. Another followed. Then eyes, dozens, not symmetrical, some blinking sideways, others weeping black sap, glinted from the pit's edge. But it wasn't climbing out, it was watching her. Then a voice echoed, not in her ears but behind her eyes. A woman's voice, familiar, soft. "My daughter, you finally came back." Grace screamed, turned to run, and slammed into someone. Strong arms caught her. It was Pastor Milton. At least it looked like him. His face was too smooth, his eyes too black, his breath too sweet. "You've opened the gate," he whispered, stroking her hair, "just like Clara said you would." Grace tried to fight, but the thing that wore Pastor Milton's skin was too strong. He dragged her toward the pit, whispering praises in an ancient tongue. At the edge, he bent low and kissed her forehead. Then he let go. She landed in silence. Not a crash, not a thud, just silence. Grace expected the cold sting of stone or the snapping agony of broken bones, but instead, her fall was swallowed by something soft, damp, and yielding. Like sinking into the lungs of some great beast, she opened her eyes. There was no light, not even her own. The flashlight had slipped from her grip during the fall, and whatever had cushioned her descent was now slithering away, retreating like a memory she couldn't hold on to. She was underground, but not in any way that made sense. The air was moist, viscous, and wrong. It pressed against her skin with a gentle pressure, as if the darkness itself were a fluid she had to wade through. Her breath fogged out, but the fog didn't vanish. It hovered, curled, and clung to her face like gauze. Something whispered in the distance, then again, closer. Whispers with no mouths. Names spoken like secrets trying to remember themselves. Grace, Clara. Grace, Clara, Clara, Clara. She stumbled forward, her hands outstretched, groping along a surface that felt like the inside of a throat, wet stone laced with pulsing fungal threads. A heartbeat echoed through the walls, steady and slow, like the distant drumming of an old god's slumber. Suddenly, light. Not her flashlight, not sunlight. It came from the ceiling, or what passed for one. Patches of glowing mold pulsed a sickly green, illuminating the corridor ahead in flashes, like a dying memory trying to relive itself. The tunnel curved downward, always downward. There was no going back. She moved. Each step sank a little. The floor wasn't solid. It gave slightly beneath her boots, like wet sand mixed with cartilage. Something brushed her ankle. She didn't look. Then the walls began to change. Faces grew from the stone. Not carved, grown, as if the very place had tried to remember those it had consumed. Eyes half-formed, mouths forever open in screams without sound. Some looked familiar, others impossibly ancient. She passed one that looked like Emily, another like Pastor Milton, except younger and laughing. There was even one that looked like herself, but with no eyes, only pits. And beneath that, Clara, fully formed. Her lips moved. Grace leaned in. "She's not what you think," Clara whispered. Grace jolted back, but the wall was smooth again, just moss and black stone. She ran. The tunnel widened into a chamber. Here, dozens of totems hung from the ceiling, bodies bound in wax and cloth, dangling by braided cords of human hair. Each one spun slowly, facing her, headless. A soft lullaby echoed in the distance, in a voice that was neither male nor female, human nor inhuman. She covered her ears. The sound seeped through anyway. Sleep beneath, sleep within, let the skin forget the sin. Something moved at the edge of the light. Not quickly, patiently, like something that had all the time in the world. Grace turned and found herself face to face with the first one. It wasn't Clara. It wasn't even human. It had a woman's shape, loosely, but its arms were too long, its neck jointed wrong, like it had been folded too many times and stitched back together with bone splinters. No eyes, just rows of small mouths where the eyes should have been, all whispering over each other like gossiping crows. "Grace," it said in 1,000 voices. "Mother?" she asked. It smiled. That was worse than anything. It reached out, fingers dragging against her jaw like dry twigs. "You opened the seal. You spilled the blood. You made the promise. I didn't promise anything, but Clara did, and you watched." She stepped back. "I was 13. The creature tilted its head. "Old enough to witness. That's all it takes." Grace turned and ran again. She didn't look back, not when the walls began to pulse, not when the floor turned slick with red moss, not even when the whispering rose into wailing. She ran until she collapsed into another chamber, this one circular, low-ceilinged and filled with water up to her knees. The water was warm and thick. Not water. Blood? No, it was thicker. Milk. Sour, curdled, and warm. She gagged. Floating in the center of the pool was a cradle, ancient, wooden, slowly rocking by itself, a baby inside, crying. Her hands moved before she could stop herself. She lifted the veil and saw her own face. Newborn, but with the same scar under the left eye, the same smudge of a freckle on her chin. Then the infant opened its mouth and screamed in her voice. Not a baby's cry, her voice. "Get me out. Get me out. Get me out." Hands shot up from the milk, dozens, bone white, fingernails chewed off, grasping. They latched onto her wrists, her ankles, her waist. She fought, kicked, screamed. Then blinding light. From above, someone was watching. Not the hollow, not the creature, someone else. And in the distance, a door, not wood, not stone. A door made of mirror. Faintly within its surface, another version of Grace. Bloodied, limp, strapped to a table, eyes open but unseeing. They're not just feeding her to something, Grace thought. They're becoming her. Then the mirror cracked. The light vanished. And from behind, she felt Mother Hollow's breath on the back of her neck. Grace froze. The breath at the nape of her neck wasn't warm. It was wet. Like something had exhaled through gills, its moisture clinging to her skin with the scent of rot and milk curdled in a tomb. She turned, slowly. Behind her, Mother Hollow loomed in full form now, not just the stitched mockery of womanhood, but something wider, deeper. The walls of the chamber had become her, grown into fleshy ribs that pulsed with life. Her limbs stretched from ceiling to floor, 100 hands twitching like dead spiders strung up by invisible threads. Her mouths whispered in layers. "Welcome back, daughter." "I'm not your daughter," Grace said through gritted teeth, though her knees trembled, her voice barely more than breath. "But you came, didn't you? You remembered the lullaby. You felt it in your marrow." "I came for Clara." That name, the creature flinched. A ripple passed through its many faces, like static in flesh. For a moment its features softened, melted, then reformed, new and wrong. Clara's face appeared again, stitched from memory and fear. Clara was never real, it cooed. The world spun. Grace stepped back, her boots sloshing through the sour milk. "What do you mean? I saw her. We grew up together. You saw what was needed. She was the key. You were the lock." The mirror behind her buzzed. She turned. The image had changed. Now, it showed a memory, but not her. A small girl, walking alone through the woods, her face smudged with ash and berries. No shoes, no name, just hunger. She stumbled upon the chapel, bleeding from the soles of her feet. The pastor found her, took her in, fed her, named her. Clara. Grace's voice cracked. She was made. "And you watched," said Mother Hollow. "But you were always closer, more pliable. He didn't choose her, he chose you." The image flickered. Pastor Milton, younger, handsome, gentler, guiding two girls by candlelight, speaking of old roots and the womb below. One girl curious, the other terrified. Then, the offering. It wasn't Clara who bled that night, it was Grace, and she had forgotten. I didn't remember. You weren't supposed to. Not yet. The walls trembled. A groaning sound, like roots splitting rock, echoed through the chamber. The cradle sank slowly into the milky pool and vanished beneath the surface. The hands that had grabbed Grace now receded, leaving only red welts behind. Mother Hollow extended one long arm and pointed to the mirror. "You want her truth? Step through. But you will not return the same." Grace didn't hesitate. She plunged forward. The mirror wasn't glass, it was membrane. It rippled as she passed through like the skin of a great eye blinking around her body. And then, silence. The world behind her was gone. Now she stood in a long hallway of rusted surgical lights, their bulbs flickering weakly in a grid overhead. The floor was linoleum but soaked, peeling in long strips. Walls of dull green tile reached up forever, smeared with words written in something brown and congealed. No exit, no entry, only birth. A hospital? No, a mockery of one. She moved forward. Each door she passed bore a different name. Emily North, Imogale Rowe, Jane Dewey. She stopped at one labeled Grace Harper. She reached out. Her fingers hovered above the handle. Behind her, footsteps, quick, bare. She turned. A little girl stood there, maybe 8 or 9, dressed in a stained shift. Her hair hung in wet ropes. Her eyes were too wide for her face. "Grace?" the girl asked. Grace nodded slowly. "Who are you?" "I'm Clara," she said simply. "The real one." Grace's blood ran cold. "I thought you weren't." "I was the first to see. The first to dream of her. He used me to find others like you." But I disobeyed. I remembered. So he fed me to her and made a better version. Grace swallowed. Why are you here? To warn you. You're not getting out. None of us do. But you might stop her if you remember everything. The little girl stepped forward and pressed her palm to Grace's forehead. A flood of visions surged through her. Screams, blood rituals in the chapel basement. Clara's eyes wide in terror as Pastor Milton dragged her down into the crypt. Grace watching from behind the pew, silent, complicit. She had chosen not to speak, chosen to forget. I didn't know. You did. And then Clara, the real Clara, smiled and vanished. The hallway lights burst one by one. Darkness surged forward like a wave. Grace turned the doorknob. The room beyond pulsed red. A hospital bed. Restraints. Monitors flashing sigils instead of vitals. And lying on the bed, her, but not her now. The future version. Pale, emaciated. Her veins black with something alive. She turned to face Grace, eyes hollow. You took too long, the future Grace said. She's already here. The lights went out. Something opened behind her. A door that wasn't there before. From its frame, the smell of the hollow blew in, and behind her the voice of Pastor Milton, whispering gently in her ear, Your name was never Grace. The first thing Grace noticed was the silence. Not absence of sound silence, but a hollowing, the kind that pushes in from all sides like pressure in a deep sea trench. It flattened her breath, squeezed her ribs, and made her ears ring with phantom voices that hadn't spoken yet. She stood at the threshold of a room that should not exist. The door she had stepped through no longer had a knob, no handle, no frame. Only pulsing red light seeping through the seams in the wall behind her, then sealing shut like a wound. She was inside the womb. Not metaphorically, literally. Everything here felt organic. The walls breathed. Thick, membranous, veined with black tendrils that twitched like earthworms in a thunderstorm. Fluids pooled around her boots, warm and copper-scented, sticking to her skin as if the very floor recognized her trespass. And in the center of the room, a crib. It was impossibly clean, white like porcelain bone, untouched by the filth around it. But something inside it moved, soft and slow, like a creature shifting in sleep. Grace didn't want to look, but her legs moved anyway, step by step, breath by breath, until she stood over the edge and peered in. The thing inside had no face, just smooth flesh like a wax baby before the mold was finished. It breathed with a mouth that hadn't opened yet. It didn't cry, but its chest rose and fell with impossible steadiness, as if it knew someone was watching. And in her mind, she heard her name. No, names. Claire, Eva, June, Mercy, Clara, Grace. All of them hers. All of them not hers. She stumbled back, hand clasping her skull as the pressure returned. Worse now. Like hundreds of thoughts were screaming to surface at once, layered voices echoing in a space her brain could no longer contain. You were born here. The voice came from her left. She turned. A mirror. But this one didn't reflect her, not as she was. It showed versions. 100 Graces. Each older or younger, each with different eyes, hair, scars. Some smiling, others broken. One was bound in a straitjacket. One held a scalpel. One stood pregnant, belly swollen with something not human, and one was Clara. Clara, but not Clara. This version had Grace's jawline, Grace's freckles, and Clara's hair. What is this? Grace whispered, reaching for the mirror, fingertips brushing cold glass. The reflection grinned, the glass shattered, not outward, but inward, as if the world behind the mirror had sucked it in like breath. In its place, a gaping hole. And from it, a hand reached out, thin, feminine, familiar. It grasped Grace's wrist with surprising gentleness and pulled. She didn't resist. The next moment, she was elsewhere, A long hallway of doors stretched ahead, each marked not by names but labels, roles, assignments, caretaker, vessel, memory, seed, warden. She walked slowly, her feet echoing across a floor made of etched teeth, molars and incisors, all pressed flat and polished. Then a sound stopped her. Whimpering. Behind the door labeled Mercy, something wept. Her hand moved without thought. She opened it. Inside, a girl huddled in the corner, no older than 10, her skin pale as candle wax, her eyes red with crying. She wore a white dress soaked in something dark. In her lap, a tattered rag doll, the kind Grace remembered from her own childhood. The girl looked up. "Are you me?" she asked. "I don't know anymore," Grace said. "She left me here, said I wasn't real enough, that I remembered too much." "Who did?" "The mother, the pastor, the one behind the door. I don't know what they are anymore. They all wear each other's faces now." Grace took a step forward. I think I need to find where it started." The girl looked down at her doll, whispered, "Then go back to the first name." Grace blinked. "Clara?" "No," said the girl. "The one before all that." And she began to sing. That song again, the lullaby. But this time, Grace understood the words. Not just a tune, a map. Each syllable naming a part of the ritual. The womb, the seed, the hollow, the mirror, the crib, the birth, the replacement. Grace turned and ran, following the tune like breadcrumbs in the dark. Hallways shifted, doors dissolved. The space responded to her will, or her memory. At last, a single stone staircase descended downward. She didn't question it. Down she went, barefoot now, her boots gone, stripped away like every layer of fall. Each step was warmer than the last. Each breath was harder to take. The walls began to whisper names, some hers, some others she didn't know. Women, girls, gone. At the bottom, a door, and carved above it, the first name was never yours. Grace placed her hand on the wood. It opened for her. Inside was a circular room lined with cradles. In each one, a sleeping girl, identical. All of them Grace, all of them Clara, all of them still, and at the center, a man, Pastor Milton, but young, smiling, hands clean, his voice gentle as he turned to her. "You made it," he said, almost lovingly. "I was beginning to think you'd forgotten completely." Grace opened her mouth, but no words came, because she remembered now. She remembered everything. And it wasn't him who created her. It was the thing he served, the thing that now stirred behind his eyes like something wearing flesh for the first time in centuries. The hollow, and as it smiled through his borrowed face, it whispered, "Shall we begin again?" Grace didn't answer the thing wearing Pastor Milton's face. She couldn't. Her throat burned, her lungs fluttered like wounded birds, and her tongue felt thick with names she didn't recognize but knew belonged to her, or at least to the versions of her that had died here before. Milton's smile remained pleasant, almost paternal, as he stepped aside, arms open like welcoming an old friend to a long-awaited dinner. Behind him, the cradles shimmered. Not just furniture anymore, but vessels, cocoons. "I know it hurts," he said softly, stepping toward her. "The fracture, the split. Memory doesn't like to be bound. It writhes. But you're nearly whole now. We're so close to restoration." "Restoration of what?" Grace rasped. "Of purpose," he said, as if the answer were obvious. "The role you were bred to fulfill. The voice of the hollow doesn't echo by accident. It selects, and you, dear Clara Grace, have been chosen more than once." He waved his hand. The world shifted again. The cradles fell away. Now she stood in a vast chapel. Stone columns towered into darkness above, strung with skin-thin banners etched in blood. The pews were filled, not with people, but figures hunched and bound in veils, their faces stitched shut. Some twitched. Some tilted their heads at her arrival. None spoke. Milton walked down the center aisle, motioning for her to follow. "We've been through this before, you and I. This is the 5th cycle. You always come back to the chapel. You always ask questions, and you always run. Until you remember what's inside you." She didn't move. He sighed. "Still resisting, but I admire your fire. It keeps the pattern fresh. This iteration is more volatile. That's promising." Grace clenched her fists. "What do you do to the girls?" A pause. Then, with theatrical reverence, he said, "They volunteered." The veiled heads in the pews twitched again. Milton continued, "They were fragments, like you, born of the same seed, some more coherent than others. Some lasted days, others years. But you were the only one who broke through." He stepped onto the altar. A slab of bone rose from the floor beneath his feet. He placed his hands on it. "I've prepared the ritual. One last passage, one final memory. And then your name will no longer matter, only the function." She didn't move, so he called the hollow. He didn't need to speak. He simply opened his mouth and darkness spilled from him. Not metaphorical darkness. Actual black fluid, like tar boiling in reverse, erupted from his lips and eyes and nostrils. It poured across the floor, coiling like intelligent smoke, slithering toward Grace with curious tendrils. And it whispered, not in English, not in Latin, but in something deeper, more primitive, older than vowels, older than breath. Grace staggered back as the smoke brushed her skin, and visions screamed into her head. She saw the original chapel, wooden, small, buried in a swamp. A woman named Judith Hollow, the first mother. She stood with a knife at her belly, singing the lullaby. She carved herself open and offered what was inside. An idea, not a child. And from that wound the Hollow was born. A concept made flesh. It needed vessels. And Judith, in death, became the first womb. The rest followed. Clara, Eva, Grace, Mercy, June, all names given to the same soul, reshaped each generation, reborn with every cycle. But this time, something had gone wrong. She'd remembered. That was never supposed to happen. "Stop," Grace muttered, the visions tearing her mind raw. But the Hollow surged forward. One tendril slithered into her mouth, cold, wet, knowing. It pulled at her lungs, her spine, her womb. It sought the seed. And then, pain. A spike of it, centered deep in her gut. She collapsed, hands trembling as her stomach convulsed. The Hollow whispered, "You are ready." But something inside her snapped. Not fear. Defiance. "No," she gasped, "not again." With the last of her strength, she reached into her coat, one pocket still real in this distorted space, and pulled out the shard of mirror she'd kept since the Hall of Reflections. She drove it into her palm, blood sprayed in jagged arcs. The Hollow screamed. It recoiled, not from the wound, but from what bled out with it. Not just blood, but memory, the truth. She hadn't just been a vessel, she had been a warden, a failsafe, a fracture point built to break the cycle. And it was working. The chapel began to tremble. Veiled figures stood, screamed without mouths. Melton staggered back as his form began to melt, his flesh sloughing off like candle wax, revealing not bones, but roots, tangled and gnarled, twisting in impossible geometry. "You were not meant to remember," the Hollow roared through him. "I was meant to end you," Grace said. She turned toward the altar and stepped forward, bleeding. But as her foot touched the first step, the chapel inverted. The floor dropped into a void. The pews collapsed into screams, and she was falling, not downward, but inward, into herself, into the seed. And as she spiraled into darkness, the last thing she heard was the Hollow's voice, soft again, seductive. "You broke the cycle, child." A pause, but what comes after the end is always worse. She woke up in her own bed, but it wasn't morning. It wasn't even night. It was nothing. Grace lay perfectly still beneath the quilt, arms rigid by her sides, eyes wide open against a darkness that felt less like an absence of light and more like a substance pressing in from all sides. The ceiling above her didn't exist, neither did the walls, and yet she knew, without question, that this was her bedroom in the hollow house. Everything was exactly as she remembered. The antique dresser with the cracked mirror, the small window with the lace curtain, the pale blue wallpaper with the faded roses. But there was no sound. No wind, no floor creaks, no hum of distant voices. Even her own breath seemed to disappear the moment it left her mouth, swallowed by the oppressive silence. For a moment she wondered if she had died. Then she sat up, and the world jolted, like something had noticed her again. She gasped. Her hand went instinctively to her stomach. No wound, no mirror shard, no blood. But the feeling remained, deep and low, like a ripple in the fabric of her being. Something had changed. Something had taken root. She slid off the bed. Her bare feet touched the wooden floor, and with the contact came a faint, almost imperceptible vibration, as though the house itself were breathing beneath her. She whispered, "Hello?" No answer. She opened the door. The hallway stretched before her, endless and wrong. Too long, too straight, too quiet. She stepped out, and the door behind her sealed shut with a gentle click. She turned back. There was no knob, no doorframe, just wall. The hallway had absorbed it like flesh healing over a scar. Panic surged, but she forced it down. She needed to think, to anchor herself. Was this still part of the ritual, a final illusion, or had she broken free and simply fallen into a deeper layer? Ahead, the hallway flickered. Not the light. There were no lights, but the walls themselves, like static across old film. For a split second she saw movement, veiled women watching from doorways, eyes sewn shut, mouths trembling with unspoken truths, and then gone. She walked. Each step echoed too loud, as if amplified in a vacuum, and she reached the stairs. They descended, but not in the usual way. The steps coiled downward like a shell, spiraling into darkness that pulsed with a dim reddish glow. There was no railing, no clear end. She hesitated. Then something behind her breathed. She turned, but there was nothing. Still, the message was clear. Forward or be swallowed. She descended, step by step, one name on her tongue. Judith. If there were answers, they would start with her. At the bottom of the staircase, she found herself in a room she had never seen before, yet knew intimately. A nursery, but not one from any sane world. The cribs were made of bone. The mobiles above them spun with small dried hands instead of stars. On the far wall, written in blood across what looked like stretched skin, were the words, "The mother birthed the void to fill herself." Grace moved forward slowly, the air dense with rotten roses. Inside one of the cribs, something moved. She approached. A baby? No, a mirror. A round handheld one, just like the one she'd shattered before. Its surface was black, like obsidian. She picked it up, and her reflection blinked, non-memeing, independently. The face in the mirror wasn't quite hers. Older, colder, and smiling. "Do you remember now?" it whispered. Grace dropped it, but the mirror didn't fall. It hung mid-air, rotating slowly. The voice continued, "You never escaped. You were never meant to. The ritual is recursive. The seed doesn't die, it grows." Grace backed away. The room began to shift. The cribs folded in on themselves. The mobiles spun faster. The walls pulsed with wet, organic movement. And then she heard it again. The song. The same lullaby from the phonograph, only now, it wasn't coming from a machine. It was coming from everywhere, from the walls, the floor, the mirror, her own throat. She tried to scream, but her mouth sang instead. A single verse, repeated, over and over. And in that moment, the floor split open like a birthing wound. From its depths, a hand reached up. Not human. Thin, impossibly long fingers, each joint twisting the wrong way, skin pale and slick with a mother's blood. Her foot, and every memory in her body exploded. She remembered all the cycles. Judith, Clara, Eva, Grace. They weren't different women. They were all her. The same soul, the same purpose. Born again and again and again, until finally, this version remembered. But what now? What happened to the one who broke the pattern? The hand gripped her ankle, pulled, and she didn't fight. Because beneath the fear, beneath the confusion, something else had awakened. A memory not of pain or death, but of power. Not hers, but something growing through her. She was no longer the vessel. She was becoming the mother. She looked up at the black mirror, still floating in midair. And this time, when the reflection smiled, she smiled back. Grace didn't resist as the hand dragged her downward, through the floor, through the screaming wood, through 100 years of buried whispers and broken hymns. Her body moved, but her mind floated, weightless and open, absorbing the layers of truth as they unfolded like diseased petals. She merged into a cathedral beneath the world, but not of stone. The walls were ribs, the ceiling a dome of spinal arches. The stained glass windows pulsed with blood, depicting scenes not from scripture, but from memory. Her memories. Each image a different life, a different name, a different death. Judith on the pyre, Clara in the asylum, Eva in the bathtub. And Grace, here now, descending as the one who remembers them all. At the far end of the cathedral stood an altar, and kneeling before it, motionless, ancient, radiant in her decay, was Judith. Her veil was gone. Her face was not monstrous, just tired, so tired. Grace stepped forward, each footfall echoing like a funeral bell. Judith spoke without turning. "You weren't supposed to remember." Her voice was layered like multiple versions of herself speaking in harmony. "But I do," Grace said, her own voice steadier than she expected. "Elevate." Judith slowly rose to her feet. Her spine cracked with the effort. When she turned, Grace felt a chill run through her, not from horror, but recognition. They were the same. Two mirrors, facing each other across time. Judith's eyes, pale, cataract-veiled, looked at Grace with something like reverence. "You were always the strongest. That's why you were chosen last. To finish it." Judith nodded. "To choose. End it, or begin again." She gestured to the altar. Upon it lay a book, its cover made of skin, its pages alive with twitching ink. Beside it, a blade. Not ceremonial, simple, clean, and next to that a small, swaddled bundle. Grace's breath caught. It moved. A child? Or something pretending to be? "You must name it," Judith said. "And in naming, you decide what it becomes." Grace approached the altar. The book whispered in her head. Fragments of spells, truths, lies, warnings. Her fingers brushed its cover, and the room tilted. Flashes. A village burning in 1891. A woman shackled to a tree, howling in tongues. A red moon and veiled midwives around a stone circle. A house built on the ashes of a cradle. Her own birth. The doctor whispering, "She has the mark too." She staggered back. "This was never about exorcism," she said, eyes wide. "It's about inheritance." Judith's smile was sad. "It always has been." Grace looked again at the swaddled thing. It cooed, soft, melodic, then opened its eyes, black, bottomless, reflective. She saw her reflection in them, not Grace, not Judith, something else. "I don't want this," she whispered. "I didn't ask for it." "No," Judith said, "but you survived, and survival writes its own laws." The blade lay between them. Grace picked it up. Its weight was unremarkable, but it pulsed, warm, like a heartbeat. "Kill it," Judith said, "and the cycle ends. The house dies. No more rebirths, no more echoes." Grace stared at the infant. Its mouth opened and spoke. "Mother." The blade trembled in her hand. It wasn't pleading. It wasn't innocent. It knew her. Judith stepped closer. Or raise it. Teach it. Let it grow into something else. But know this, whatever you choose, you must seal it. Grace met her gaze. And what if I don't? Judith's voice turned hollow. Then the door remains open. Forever. And others will come. Grace stood at the edge of that decision for what felt like years. She looked again at the book, the blade, the child. Then she turned her back on them, walked past Judith, toward the cathedral doors. Judith called after her, "Where are you going?" Grace didn't answer. She reached the door. It had no handles, no keyhole, but as she raised her hand, the bone doors opened, not with force, but with recognition. Outside was not the world. It was a mirror, a towering obsidian sheet stretching to the horizon. She stepped through and split, not in body, in being. She became the next echo, the next whisper, the next scene. Somewhere, in a distant time, a baby was born in a house with blue wallpaper and veiled windows. She would be named Lily. She would grow up never knowing the truth, until one day the house remembered her, and the mirror blinked. Thank you for staying with us until the very end. If you've made it this far, through shadows and silence, through whispers that echoed across time and bloodlines, then you already know some houses aren't haunted, they remember. This story was never just about ghosts or rituals. It was about memory, how it lingers, how it infects, how it passes from one name to the next. To everyone who listened, who dared to follow Grace through the last door, thank you. Your presence kept the light on just long enough. But be warned, some echoes don't fade, they follow. So tonight, when you close your eyes and the house creaks a little too loudly, ask yourself, is it settling or is it remembering you? Sleep well, if you can. And if you enjoyed this descent into darkness, consider subscribing, sharing, and returning. We always leave a door open.